right. All right, boys and girls. We are going to be talking about the state of Ohio, our government, our Constitution. So a lot of this is going to be history. So giving you some background. These are standards that the state of Ohio says that you must know. Okay, so the Ohio Constitution was drafted in 1851 to address difficulties in the governing of the state of Ohio. So our government wasn't doing so well before 1851, and there were some problems that we needed to fix. As a framework for the state, the Ohio Constitution complements the federal structure of government in the U.S. We have three branches of government, okay, checks and balances, so there's a lot of similarities with us and the feds. And individuals in Ohio have a responsibility to assist state and local governments as they address relevant and often controversial problems that directly affect their communities. So, that one's not really tested per se, but it's, in my view, probably the most important that you actually get involved, not just in federal politics, talking about a president, but actually getting involved in contacting county commissioners when you need to, or state representatives, that kind of thing. So, here we go. What came first? State constitutions or the U.S. Constitution? Well, the answer to that is state constitutions. If you remember, the state constitutions were first started in the former colonies pretty much right after the Declaration. They threw away these charters from the English crown and started their own governments. And the U.S. Constitution comes later. Ohio's state constitution is much longer than the U.S. Constitution, many more amendments. All right, so a few things here. The Northwest Ordinance is a thing that was passed prior to your U.S. Constitution, and basically it guaranteed rights in areas that were out west. Okay, so people are starting to move into what they call the Ohio Territory, the Ohio River Valley, and areas that would become, like Ohio and Kentucky. And so when those people were there, kind of settling, the Northwest Ordinance established that those people were entitled to things like religious freedom, the writ of habeas corpus. So, in order to be held in custody, law enforcement needed to tell them why they were being held, trial by jury, due process. A lot of those things we find in the first 10 amendments. A public education. Slavery was outlawed in the Northwest Territory, and respect and fair treatment of Indians, which wasn't really adhered to a lot of times. So, anyways, path to statehood for Ohio. Population for statehood was 60,000 free adult males. Is what it was originally supposed to be established in the Northwest Ordinance. However, on April 30th, 1802, Thomas Jefferson, who has now become president, he signed an enabling act that allowed Ohio to become a state, even though we didn't quite meet that 60,000 free adult male threshold. So the act defined the boundaries of the new state, set up our election and delegates to form a state constitution. Now, Ohio was one of the first, was the first of 5 states carved out of the Northwest Territory, and the rest being Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, and a small part of Minnesota. Many of you already know it's the 17th state, and admitted to the Union after the original 13, Vermont, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Admission to the Union, per the requirement of the Northwest Ordinance, was on equal footing with the original states. So basically, what that meant is that Ohio would have the same amount of power, according to the Constitution. It would be on equal footing with all the other states. So, 1802, we draft our original Constitution. 35 delegates were elected from 9 counties in October of 1802. Most important issue was slavery at this convention. The convention lasted an entire month from November of 1802 in Chillicothe, Ohio. Chillicothe, a former capital of Ohio. 35 delegates voted unanimously. All of them voted to ratify the Constitution, and it contained a preamble and 8 articles. And we kind of gleaned some influences from other states to form that. So the 1802 Constitution was set up with a supreme legislature, or General Assembly, and this Congress, our state Congress called the General Assembly. It's a bicameral legislature, much like our Congress at the federal level. Representatives 1-year terms, senators for 2-year terms. You had broad power of appointment, almost all judges in executive departments. So the Congress would actually appoint people who would be in the judicial and executive branches. Almost unrestricted legislative power and power to create new counties. So the legislature by far is the most powerful branch out of the 3 at the beginning. The governor would serve a 2-year term. He had term limited 6 years in any 8-year period. No veto power and very limited appointment power. Was the commander-in-chief of the state militia and had the power to grant pardons and reprieves. Very, very limited power there. Supreme Court and the Courts of Common Pleas judges appointed by a General Assembly vote for 7-year terms. Justices of the peace elected by township voters for 3-year terms, and the Supreme Court was obligated to hold court annually in each county. They had a traveling court. It was very, very strange. So they would go from each county to county, and they would try cases in each one of the Ohio counties. So in 1802, the people who could vote, the electorate, so the right to vote was limited to white males 21 years or older who paid or were charged a state or county tax. So a tax was a part of how you could vote, which was interesting. We did have a Bill of Rights, Article 8. 28 sections included all protections guaranteed or contained in the Federal Bill of Rights and the Northwest Ordinance, and it also had a prohibition of poll taxes and open and free printing presses to examine the proceedings of any branch of government. It's kind of interesting. The legislative abuses under the 1802 Constitution, legislative districts for House of Representatives and Senators were gerrymandered by whatever political party was in power. New forms of taxation, they borrowed heavily. They weren't very good with money. The judiciary, the circuit writing responsibility of the Supreme Court, and heavy caseloads resulted in backlogs. So the fact that they had to go from county to county was kind of a pain in the butt. And, this and the fact that Ohio was growing very rapidly. Our population really goes crazy from 1800 to 1850. We now have 88 counties in the state, but you go from 8 counties to 87 counties, and the Supreme Court has to go to each one of those counties and hold court each year. They didn't get a whole lot done, so there was a backlog or a lot of cases that were waiting to be heard. So in 1851, we decided to have a constitutional convention, and we had 108 delegates at this convention. It lasts quite a while, from May of 1850 to March of 1851. You had a bunch of different political parties, rather. Democrats, Whigs, a new party called the Republicans, Free Soilers, Independents, and even Socialists. And this new Constitution, so it expands the list of elected officials to it, a lieutenant governor, auditor, treasurer, and attorney general. It provides for an elected judiciary, which we still have today. We vote for the Supreme Court, which is different from the federal level. The governor gets a little more power, but he still doesn't have a veto power. And there's a limitation on legislative power and indebtedness. Remember, the legislature is having issues with money. They're borrowing too much. We're going into debt. So a mandatory vote on holding constitutional convention every 20 years. We still do that. So, the electoral approval. Voters approved this new Constitution in 1851, and on a separate vote, it was rejected to license in trafficking intoxicating liquors. Just kind of a, I don't know, odd, quirky fact. And your experience here, still difficult to amend. Ratification required a majority of all voters at the election and not simply a majority of those voting on the proposed amendment. So that's kind of splitting hairs there. But if, for instance, if a bunch of people voted in an election but they didn't vote for everything on their ballot, an amendment needed a majority of all the voters in that election, not just the ones that voted for the amendment or against it. So supporters of the convention, Direct Legislation League, Progressives, Labor, Municipal Home Rule supporters, liquor interests, and women's suffrage, they were all in support of this new constitutional convention that we end up having in 1912. And so we kind of updated from the 1851 version of it. We have the initiative and petition process. It's loosening of the amendment process. And this right here is part of the reason why our Constitution is so long, is because you, as a citizen, if you get enough signatures in the state of Ohio, you can get a ballot question put on the ballot. And so that has happened, a fair amount. It hasn't been very successful of actually passing, but and the state legislature actually has made quite a few more amendments than the people have. But the legislative veto overturn dropped from 2/3 to 3/5. A direct primary election for most public officials, so we're expanding the amount of people we actually choose as we the people. Establishment of the superintendent of public instruction, home rule, employee rights, permitting licenses to traffic in intoxicating liquor, and expanded Ohio Supreme Court membership to 7 and provided for a Chief Justice, and that is the way it is today. Things that were rejected. Women in 1912 still didn't get the right to vote in Ohio, and the banning of capital punishment, we still have that. So since 1913, so after this convention, 120 amendments have been added to the Ohio Constitution, but as I said, only a few of them have actually been done by that petition process known as the initiative. The other 102 have been passed by the General Assembly or the state legislature. Since November 2011, the Attorney General has certified the following initiatives. So these are things that got onto the ballot. They didn't necessarily pass. So even back in 2013, one of the first times we voted for a legalization of marijuana in some way. You've got, you had medical cannabis again in 2012. And so there's just a bunch of different things that people have gotten on the ballot and that the Ohio Attorney General has allowed to be voted on. So as I said, every 20 years, the voters of Ohio have a chance to vote on convening a constitutional convention. This has only happened a couple of times. So since 1851, we've only had a convention twice. The most recent vote was in 2012, and the measure failed by 2 million votes. There wasn't anything major that people wanted to do. And so in 1972, Ohio looked to revise the Ohio Constitution with the Ohio Constitutional Revision Commission. 16 amendments were approved, such as a joint election of governor and lieutenant governor. They repealed obsolete provisions such as a public printing and dueling, which, you stand back to back, head out, 40 paces, whatever it is, and turn around and shoot a gun at each other. That was still in our Constitution, so we got rid of that. In 2011, the Ohio Constitutional Modernization Commission was created, and they're in the beginning stages of their work, and they have until 2021 to complete this work. So it's just a way to try and update our Constitution for a more, for a present day. All right, that's it. I know that wasn't exactly exciting, but just a little bit of history about our state government.